This is Jillian Hartley on behalf of Arkansas Northeastern College. We are doing a Cold War narrative history with Deanita Hicks today. Miss Hicks, do I have permission to record you today?
Yes, you do.
Okay. So you've agreed to this interview because you have a large part of your life has been spent or was spent during the Cold War era. And I would like to start by asking you about your dad, because your dad did come to Blytheville because he was in the Air Force, correct?
Yes, and my mother and dad would have never met if he hadn't come to the Blytheville Air Force Base. And that would have been tragic for me, but it would have been it was just weird that he wasn't from around here and he came to the air base and my mom met him.
Well, what did he do in the Air Force?
I think he did body work on
Okay.
cars and stuff like that, or truck, whatever the vehicles were. He did body work, and he was really good at that. He did it lifelong.
Nice. And his name was Dean Stewart.
Dean Stewart.
Nice.
Actually, Shirley Dean Stewart, but he went by Dean Stewart.
Very good. Do you know what made him want to join the Air Force? Like his...
I don't have any idea about that before, but I remember being on the base when I was young. Maybe when they went bowling or something like that.
Okay, the Blytheville Air Force Base.
But I was little, really little. I don't know how I even remember.
But you later went to the base, so you remember the size and the enormity of it.
And it was the Blytheville Air Force Base, and it was very well known, and it was very well kept at that time. And it was a real experience to even go there because I felt like I was somewhere big,
Yeah.
And my mother and daddy actually got married on the base.
Really?
Yeah, I have a wedding picture.
So obviously the Air Force Base is built in the context of the Cold War. So looking at the Cold War, what kind of early memories do you have about learning about the Cold War, the conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union?
Yeah, really, that covered my whole childhood from first grade, from little bitty, all the way to when I was, even after I graduated from high school. And one of the main memories I have of that, I don't know all the details I should, but I do remember we were scared, and we had a sort of always holding over us that we could be bombed at any moment. And we would even get under our desk and practice drills in first grade. I remember first, second, third grade being under a desk and thinking later as I was older, how would that have helped us? But in the day, that was the thing you had to do. You had to be ready just in case the Russians came to get you.
Well, and as a follow-up to that, so what sort of perceptions did you have of the Soviets, the Russians?
Okay, I always heard Russian all of my life, and I know Soviet Union, but we always said Russians. And I remember thinking that they were communist and that it was scary and that the United States was in a Cold War with them. That meant we really didn't have battles, but there was a chilliness and an aloofness that kept us always watching what they were doing in Europe and what they would do, because we always said that if they ever got a foothold in other places, they would be on us soon. And that was a fear when we were growing up, that something like that could happen.
So you were born in the late 1950s, correct?
57.
Okay. So in that era, do you remember, you probably have quite a few memories about the Vietnam era. Okay.
Yeah.
So do you have, what kind of feelings or perceptions do you have reflecting back upon Vietnam and the battle against the communists there?
Okay. The thing that always stands out to me about the Vietnam War is that there's a lot of mythology, in a way, about the way soldiers were treated when they came back and the way things were. Now, there were protests, and I remember the protests, and I remember the Kent State. I remember all those things. I remember, and just a jumble in my head because I watched the news all the time. And I remember feeling like we shouldn't have been there, that it was a bad thing, because the news kind of gave me that impression that it was not, and it was called a conflict, and it wasn't, but it was a really bad time. And my father-in-law was there. And when he came back, he was a totally different man. And a lot of people I know came back, and they were different. They had seen things and been involved in things that were just terrible for them. And a lot of them came back as alcoholics and had issues. Not all of them. My uncle flew a chopper in the Vietnam War. My Uncle Slug, who lives in Utah now, he flew a chopper, and I remembered that connection, and I always thought he was a hero because that seemed heroic to me. But I remember Johnson and all the people who were against the war and how Johnson had to kind of compromise, and that's mainly my memory of it.
And you kind of had
the music.
Right, and music, and you had that experience of things being televised.
I mean, every day. I remember one of the biggest memories I have is every night on the news there would be something about how many people were killed in Vietnam and how many people were killed in both, with the Vietnamese and us. And I remember those terrible pictures of the massacre. And I remember the little child running with the nape. I mean, it was a terrible time, and I remember that war. And I think that's when I began to think, why do we have wars, and what good is this? And it really worried me. That's kind of the idea I had.
Well, and in that era too, you may, I'm going to ask if you have any sort of memories from the Cuban Missile Crisis, because you would have been pretty young, but you.
Well, what year was that?
So 1963.
Okay, I would have been in about. Not quite first grade.
Wait, Cuban Missile Crisis is 1962, right?
I think it's something like that. I was a toddler.
Know. Yeah, and
it was before I went to school. But I do remember everybody being tense and something bad was happening in Cuba and Kennedy. I remember Kennedy being involved and then I later learned, as I was an older person, that really the Blytheville Air Force Base was a strategic kind of place, and that I could have been annihilated if anything had really happened there, because I always lived within 25 miles of this area of Missouri and Blytheville. Always within 25. I've never lived any more farther than 25 miles away from the air base.
So having an air base in some ways maybe added then to the fear of right, because you grew up in rural southeast Missouri.
Yeah, and we could hear planes going over and see a lot of things like that.
Wow.
Yeah. Still can.
So from the Cold War era, are there any specific presidents or leaders who stood out to you?
Yeah, Gorbachev and Reagan, for real. Because those two I get the impression that they were trying to work together to end the Cold War and get the Berlin Wall taken down so that Germany could reunite. And I remember what Reagan said. I think he said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." And I remember that being a really big deal. And it was like the Cold War was coming to an end because two people were talking and trying. And Gorbachev opened up what we called Russia then, but he opened it up where you could listen to radio and watch television and say things, and it wasn't as scary a time as it was before, is what I remember.
I happen to know that you enjoy studying a lot about music.
Mm-hmm.
And are there any particular people who went in during that time that stand out to you?
Well, there's that song, "Come on, people now, smile on your brother, everybody get together, try to love one another." That was sort of the mantra that was in my head through my childhood, and it would explain why I am the way I am today. That and other songs like that begged for peace and love and understanding. Thinking of the Beatles and all of those people. Like, imagine, the word imagine. Think about it. No schools, no churches to fight over, no religions to fight over, just people being people, and love.
Living in peace.
Yeah, I think I'm a hippie is what I think I am.
Well, I think that, we've kind of touched a little bit upon, like, what the U.S. did to deter communism in Southeast Asia.
Mm-hmm.
And, we now can look back and reflect on that era. So, when looking at just our overall fight against the communists, do you have any reflections or opinions of the, one thing that we do know a lot more is, like, after Russia pulled out of the Soviet Union and it collapsed, we had a lot of records that were then open, and we found out a lot about the side on that end, the Soviet Union. So reflecting back kind of on your experiences, but also taking into account what we know now, what kind of feelings do you have about the war against the communists?
I remember thinking that at the time, and as I got older in my teenage years, I thought we were overdoing it a bit, and I thought that we were too worried and too scared, and we hated the Russians, whatever they did, and we thought they were terrible people, and we just had this attitude, it seemed, and anything that was red or Russian was, that's bad. But what gets me is that today we're sort of looking at the same thing with some reversals. We have a Soviet Union who is moving on and trying to take over parts of Europe, and they're getting a foothold in Ukraine and all of that. And the Republicans who used to say, oh, the Russians are terrible, they're this, they're that, and the other, now are the people who sort of have a soft spot for the Russians. And to me, it's more timely than ever that we watch out for all that spread of Soviet doctrines and things like that. It's scarier to me than ever in that sense. And after all the years since the Cold War was supposedly over, now I feel that same fear again sometimes about, boy, we could all be annihilated in just 1 second.
And it's the authoritarian type element
yes,
there that
it scares me to death.
Because definitely with communism falling, there's aspects of it that have stayed.
Yeah,
I think a lot of people would agree with that. So I do want to ask a little bit about the space race, because you say you were born in 1957, right? Mm-hmm. So you probably don't remember a lot about Sputnik, but you definitely had your childhood at a time that is during that period between there and us going into space.
Oh, yeah.
So do you have any reflections about the space race?
Yes. I thought that was the coolest thing ever, that someone could actually walk on the moon and put a flag on the moon and all of that. And I remember also during that time I was thinking of Kennedy and the assassinations that happened and real upheaval in the world. But that space race, it seemed that we were winning. And I do remember studying about Sputnik. That was the Russians.
The satellite, yeah.
And I remember that, but I've really paid attention to us going there. And I've heard people since then say, oh, that wasn't real, it was televised and all that. But I didn't ever doubt for a minute that we had the technology and that we did because that was a big deal. And I remember seeing it on television and watching every bit of it and thinking how eerie and weird it was that somebody was on the moon walking.
Do you think it gave people a sense of hope?
I think it did, because we saw that we were really ahead in a lot of ways. And I think the problem, maybe even with the Cold War, was we were always in competition with the other superpowers at the time. And I still think we're a superpower, and I still think we're ahead of most others in most ways. But that was really a sign that we were moving on.
Well, when looking at, you talked about one song, and I know how much you love songs, and, is there any other, like, pop culture song, movie, something else that stands out to you from that Cold War era? Because, you have a lot of background, for anybody listening who doesn't know it, in, literary and heritage traditions and things like that. And did you see any trends, for example, that you would go, well, definitely some of the things happening with the Cold War were influencing are and how we manifested them at home.
This may not have anything to do with this at all, but I remember John Lennon and Yoko lying in the bed and being videotaped and put on the cover of Rolling Stone. And that was sort of a lay-in, I guess, a lie-in about peace. And I just remember some acts like that people did to show that war and hate was not the way. And that may have nothing to do with it, but that's what I remember.
No, I think it's a good example, and because there were people who had mixed opinions about what they did. Mm-hmm. So the Berlin Wall came down, and do you remember when it came down? Do you remember where you were?
I remember it. What year was that? 89. 89.
89, right? Yeah.
Okay, 89. Sure. Well, this sounds silly to mention, and I'll probably be laughed out of the place. But during that time, I was really a Bruce Springsteen fan, and I still am. And I remember reading in an article about Bruce Springsteen that he was one of the people who said the wall has to come down. And he was in concert and apparently influenced a lot of people at that time because, in 84 he had Born in the USA and all that. So then his fame just sort of rose. And he had a lot to say about the wall coming down. And my husband, my husband Michael, was over there in the Army. And he remembers people would get pieces of the wall and things like that. That's just my memory of the wall. I must have been busy getting degrees and teaching and all that, so I didn't pay as much attention as I probably should have.
Well, I know.
But I knew it was a good thing.
So you mentioned Bruce Springsteen.
Mm-hmm.
And, of course, he definitely has, from the late 70s to, some would even argue today, a little bit of a political slant.
I would argue that.
Do you see any evolution in his music from that's sort of influenced by a lot of those outside political factors?
Yes. I think Springsteen and I have a lot in common as far as the way we look at the world. And that's probably why I like him so much. And I've always been about political music. I've always loved political music, whether it was James Brown, Black and I'm Proud, or anything that Bruce Springsteen does, or Joan Baez. I've always loved John Fogerty, who also wrote a lot of songs about Vietnam. I just always thought that they had the same mindset that I had. And I forgot the question.
Well, looking at Bruce, because his
evolving.
And I may have this wrong, but am I right that when Reagan ran in 84, he was using Born in the USA, and Reagan kind of said,
this is a man of the people. He's a hard-working man. He's a middle-class man of the people. And really, Bruce had never, he says in his Broadway show, I never did any honest work. I was always a musician. I tried to paint houses for a while. I did this and that. His father did all the work at the rug factories and driving the bus and all that. So he grew up in a working-class family, a Catholic family, big family. But he always kept his finger on the pulse. And, Cornel West has said that he was naming all the soul men in the world, people who have soul and who sort of know what's good for other, the way that things should be. And he named Bruce Springsteen as a soul man. And, if you don't know about Bruce Springsteen, you don't know that's what's true about him. But he really is a person who looks into the soul. If you ever listen to him much, his characters are all so real. And you think it's him. He didn't go through a lot of the stuff he writes about, but he had empathy. He knew. And I don't want to get too far into Bruce Springsteen. But
well, we could do a whole interview on Bruce. So we're kind of reflecting on the Cold War. We kind of touched upon how, you grew up at a time where you were probably taught in class, if I had to guess, a very, very pro-U.S.
Oh, yes.
version. So kind of reflecting back on the accuracy and the of early education and stuff, do you have any thoughts? And of course, not trying to like down any teachers or anything, but
No.
Definitely during the 50s and 60s, there was some pushback, especially from universities, especially like in the 60s. So looking at the accuracy of how things were taught, then after the wall collapse comes down and stuff, learning a little bit more about the Russian people. Do you have any reflections to share?
I always had the feeling that it was sort of overblown, that we, at that time, we did the right thing, and we did the right thing in World War II, and then all of this came about. I think we were doing the right thing, but I think we had a lot of propaganda, a lot of pro-American propaganda, and I'm a patriot to the hilt, but I'm the patriot who says if we're wrong, we got to fix something, and if we're right, let's celebrate it. And I remember thinking that it was quite overdone sometimes, and in the 80s especially, when movies came out that were all about American might and they were just almost subsidized by groups that thought we should know that the Russians were bad and we were good.
Well, and many of the bad guys in movies and even on cartoons and stuff, people had Russian accents.
Oh, yes.
It's
Boris
ingrained
Karloff.
very.
Boris. There was this cartoon character that was the bad guy, and I can't think of his name now.
Was it Rocky and Bullwinkle?
Yeah, I think one of them was the bad guy.
That guy had a Russian accent. So just kind of one final question here, because you lived a large portion of your life during the Cold War, but you've also had, what are we now, about 30 years out?
Yep.
So if you could look back that sort of early part of your life and from the things that we've learned from the downfall of the Soviet Union since, what would be some of the lessons you would tell, especially younger people? Because a lot of people, today don't have any memories of the Cold War. They were born after it. So looking at sort of the legacy or the long-term things to really, teach the younger generation, what lessons would you say stand out to you and why?
Always try to find out the facts, because if you just listen to propaganda, you're going to go to the extremes. And that is really what's being done a lot today. And it worries me. And I was reading an article this morning, I'll try to make this quick, about today being the anniversary of 9/11. And it is. And that a lot of Generation Z, a lot of young people are making jokes about 9/11, like saying, oh, this is my 9/11 or something, when something happens to them, like they've chipped their fingernail or something. And they have jokes about something that we all took very seriously and were scared to death about, because it was one of the first big things that's happened that showed that not all the world was pleased with us. And it really upset a lot of people. And we supposedly came together and put out all the flags, and we loved the patriotic feelings that we all had. And I want young people to know you should never take for granted that we are always safe and that nothing can happen to America, because they've seen that lots of things can happen to America. But I don't want anybody to ever falsify or overblow something that another country does just to make us look good and them look bad. That's kind of the thing I come away with.
It's a good thought. Well, Deanita Hicks, thank you for coming and doing this interview with me on September 11th, 2024. We definitely appreciate it, and your reflections are extraordinarily important, and I think that you're signing off with that latter lesson is one that hopefully young people will take in mind.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was fun.